And hello, Nijay. It's good to see you in this bright year of 2021. And so far, I don't know about you, but after watching the news, I'm kind of pining for 2020. 2020 had less insurrections. That was that's what I miss about 2020, Nij. Not the pandemic, the lack of insurrections. What about you? What do you?
Yeah, it's been insane lately. If you're watching this video months and months after we recorded it, this was all the crazy stuff that happened at the U.S. Capitol building. I mean, unbelievable that we thought 2020 was bad, and now we got this going on. So I just tell people, lock your doors, kiss your loved ones, and whenever people say Happy New Year, my answer usually is, I'm gonna wait and see kind of moment.
Exactly. But anyway, Nij, I'm writing. Well, I'm here with you from Australia, currently under house arrest because there was a slight outbreak in Sydney, and the Premier required everyone to come home and to self quarantine for 14 days. But apart from that, I'm doing pretty well. I'm pretty happy. Uh, but we're here today to discuss Paul's letter to the Galatians,
Mhm.
particularly, Nijay, in light of your forthcoming commentary in the Story of God Bible commentary series. Now, you are a Paul man. You are a Paul person, a Paul scholar.
Right.
Um, but what did you learn from writing a commentary on Galatians? Because I find when you write a commentary, it's like you still, I mean, you read stuff, you teach it in class, but when you've got to work through it methodically, verse by verse, and say something about application, you actually do learn quite a lot. What did you learn from writing your Galatians commentary?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I've written commentaries before, so I wrote on Colossians towards the early part of my career, and then First, Second Thessalonians. Galatians is different because there's just so much more literature out there, so many more heated debates on kind of this as a very pivotal text. But it was exciting in one sense because recent work by John Barclay and all the debates about Pistis Christou. And I taught a Regent College course, and professors had recently taught there, like N.T. Wright recently taught Galatians there. I think F.F. Bruce taught Galatians there. And so it's a really exciting book to work on. I would say some of the things I came away with, and Mike, you come from a more reformed tradition and I don't, so I see it a little bit differently than you. But I found that there were a couple of themes that really stood out to me that I didn't see in a lot of the scholarship that I encountered. One was family. Family seems to be a really big part of this letter. And I just don't really see that present in a lot of the monographs and scholarship and articles. It's making it come back with, the work of Esau Macaulay, who's done stuff on inheritance. But I felt like I was really scratching some new ground and trying to make that case. The other is freedom. Now, scholars have talked about freedom before, but kind of the old language of Christian liberty, I think, didn't really quite hit on what I think Galatians is about. A lot of it is freedom from superstition, freedom from fear of evil, and being kind of trapped by evil. So I felt like there was another way of looking at freedom in the letter, and I feel like it's a far more important theme than scholars give it credit for. And so I was really excited to explore, especially those two themes in the letter.
That
And
sounds
love, I would say love is another one, and that comes up, in different scholars. But I'm working on a monograph on Paul's theology of love, so it was fresh in my mind. And there's quite a lot in Galatians to work through on the imagery and language of love.
Yeah, well, I mean that's good. I would have said there's a bit on family stuff, but it certainly doesn't naturally jump out at me when I think about Galatians. Definitely freedom. I think chapter for freedom Christ has set you free.
Yep, chapter
You know,
5.
chapter 5. I think that's very big, and yeah, and the love theme. Yeah, I think that definitely is neglected because isn't that like Galatians 5:6? That's like a definition of faith is like faith working through love. So love kind of defines the nature of faith in many ways. Well, I mean, this is a little bit different, Nijay. I'm used to thinking that Galatians was about the imputed righteousness of the active obedience of Jesus, which is different from his passive obedience, which fulfills the pactum salutis based on the eternal decision of God, so we could be simul justus et peccator. I mean, that's what I thought Galatians was about, when I was in my angry reformed phase. which lasted until, I think, what was it, Tuesday. But I'm out of that now. I'm much more up on that. I can remember a time when Galatians was very much the center of debate about the new perspective on Paul. And I always felt that Galatians is where the new perspective on Paul people kind of had the better end of the argument, because Paul is not just arguing about what must I do to be saved. He's kind of arguing about, and who are God's people and how do you tell? Okay. So then that question of what must I do to be saved and who are the saved, they kind of go together. And there is a sense that being justified, on the one hand, is Paul's defense of the gospel, but on the other hand, it's also his defense of Gentiles being included in the church as Gentiles. In other words, Gentiles do not have to become Jews in order to be Christians. Okay, so I've always thought that the New Perspective guys had a little bit of the better of the argument there. But a lot of other sort of, schools of interpretation have found traction in Galatians as well. And we could refer to two. One would be the Apocalyptic Paul school. And then there's also the Paul within Judaism school. Now, the Apocalyptic school is probably represented by J.L. Martin's very famous commentary on Galatians in the Anchor Bible series. And then there's the sort of Paul within Judaism crowd, you could argue, is best represented by Mark Nanos's commentary in Galatians, and some of the work by people like Paula Fredrickson and Pamela Eisenbaum and others. Do you have any thoughts on these two schools or these two sort of modes of interpretation of Paul?
Yeah, Mike, you know that I'm kind of a disciple of Jimmy Dunn. So, I have ties to the two of the three unholy Trinity members of the New Perspective. I worked a bit with N.T. Wright when he was teaching at Cranmer Hall, when he was Bishop of Durham. I was his TA for a course, and I got to know him a little bit. And then I spent a lot of time with Jimmy over coffee. So my commentary is very clearly in the orbit of New Perspective. But I feel like Jimmy, if people only read Jimmy's New Perspective book, they don't get the full Jimmy. You got to read his Theology of Paul the Apostle. Yeah. And then you get what I feel like is a pretty well-rounded New Testament theology, Pauline theology, excuse me. So my approach is very similar to Jimmy's. When it comes to some of this other stuff, especially Paul within Judaism, I find that really hard to sustain in Galatians. So for example, I remember reviewing Matt Thiessen's Paul and the Gentile Problem. And as I was working on my Galatians commentary, I'm reviewing his monograph, which argues for this Paul within Judaism. And there's some things that Paul says in Galatians that just could not be acceptable to Jews. For example, Paul says, the law is not of faith. And I cannot fathom any Jew ever saying that, if you understand faith as Habakkuk 2:4, the righteous will live by faith. So when it comes to that, I just can't see Galatians compatible with that view. Apocalyptic Paul, I don't feel like Apocalyptic New Perspective have to be complete opposites. I feel like someone like Richard Hayes shows an interesting mixture of New Perspective. He's associated with New Perspective, and Hayes is associated with the Apocalyptic Paul because of his appreciation for Martin's work. So I don't see it as a both and. I like the tension there. And I think Tom Wright has done a good job of actually saying Apocalyptic and so-called New Perspective are not incompatible. Yeah. Do you think Tom Wright is kind of saying that in some of his work?
I think Tom would say that, as long as you understand apocalyptic eschatology, or as long as you understand that properly, right, there's no tension. The problem I have with the apocalyptic Paul argument is that I don't think it's actually apocalyptic. They've used the word, but there's nothing actually apocalyptic about it. Galatians, begins off, with this wonderful language, Christ gave himself to rescue us from the present evil age according to the will of God the Father. So there's an apocalyptic worldview or premise operating. But for the apocalyptic Paul crowd, I think the main thing to understand is they're more or less Barthian readers, or a certain phase of Karl Barth, and that has a kind of, a more punctiliar invasion of grace over and against religion as represented by Judaism. So I tend to think of it as more of a Barthian reading. And look, I'm not anti-Barthian. I mean, I like a little bit of Karl Barth. I'm just not convinced that's the best way to read Galatians. Now, undoubtedly, some apocalyptic Paul people will be going apoplectic at what I'm saying. And there's a variety, and there's sort of a school there. So I think there's some aspects that they're right, their overall framework, but their taxonomy of what counts as apocalyptic, like there's forensic and there's cosmic, I think that just doesn't work. And other people who work in ancient apocalypses say the same thing. On the Paul within Judaism, I do have a little bit of sympathy here. I mean, I would argue that the new perspective on Paul is trying to read Paul within Judaism, as opposed to Protestant theology. So I tend to think that the new perspective was the original Paul within Judaism. But like you say, part of the problems I have with the Paul within Judaism crowd are in some of their aspects, they end up with a Paul where everything that he says that could be potentially offensive to Jews or Jewish sensibilities is blunted or explained away. And Paul just says some things that I cannot imagine people hearing without being enraged. Like he says, like the Torah brings wrath, or stuff like that. Or, the Torah was temporary. Or even moreover, he says the law, the Torah is bound up with sin and death. In other words, he treats the Torah as if it was part of the problem in some sense. And within Galatians, he comes with an abee's whisker of saying it was given by angels, not by God. I mean, if Galatians was the only book we had of Paul, you could say Marcion was onto something, okay? You could argue something like that. So I feel like a lot of the things that Paul says about his fellow Jews, about the law, I think that certainly does great. And you can understand how people would consider Paul to be an apostate, even while he's striving and claiming to be a faithful Jew. Okay, he believes he's faithful to Israel's covenant, its law, but as understood from the vantage point of his messianic faith and his experience of the Spirit. And so I have moved a little bit to be a little bit more sympathetic to the Paul within Judaism crowd. I'd probably put myself between Tom Wright and someone like Marcus Bockmuir when it comes to reading Paul. Maybe with a sprinkling of Francis Watson just to keep it interesting. But yeah, that's kind of how I see it. So yeah, both things have got something going for them. The apocalyptic Paul captures the apocalyptic texture. I think we should read Paul within Judaism, but what they actually do with it in the specifics, I don't always find convincing.
Well, with the Paul within Judaism kind of approach, one of the dangers is they do a lot of guesswork with audience analysis. Now, this comes into play a bit more in Romans than in Galatians, but they have to guess that the audience is almost entirely Gentile so that people don't get mixed up on what the teachings are directed towards. And my question would be, would Paul be so concerned to make sure that only the right people are reading these letters? He expects letters to be swapped and people to read them in different churches, as we gather from Colossians. And so this idea that, the audience must be entirely Gentile, that's a lot of guess that you're putting a lot on. A lot is riding on that, I guess, is one way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to use inferences as load-bearing things for the argument that you're building on. I guess that's the main thing to take away. But yeah, well, I don't think any of the Paul within Judaism or apocalyptic crowd are going to go repenting in sackcloth and ashes because we were not particularly convinced by everything they've said. But let's talk about something else in Galatians, something I know is very dear to your heart, and that's the theme of pistis. Okay. I mean, you've written a whole book on Paul and the language of faith. What do you notice, Nijay, about faith in Galatians or pistis language?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things I'll mention. I mean, I wrote a whole book on it, so it's hard to summarize, but a couple of things I'll mention. One is, Jonathan Pennington visited me here giving some lectures at Western Seminary nearby. We had a chance to sit down and talk a couple of years ago. And I explained to him how I wanted to explain Paul's faith language in a very multifaceted way. And he's drawing from gospel studies. He said, so you're saying it's a tensive symbol? I said, what's that? So he explained to me, in gospel studies, they refer to something like the kingdom of God as a tensive symbol, in the sense that you can't just point to one referent to that and say, okay, it's this one thing, like a building or a people, or, it is kind of this placeholder term for a kind of a whole world in and of itself. And it's hard to just kind of point to one thing and say that's the kingdom of God. And in many ways, that's how Paul uses faith language. He uses it as this kind of symbol for something. And I talk about that as the Christ relation, which is language I get from Chris Tilling. By that, I mean, I think it's talking less about my faith in Jesus, and it's not necessarily talking about his faithfulness to me or his faithfulness to God, but it's talking about the fact of this unique relationship that has been created in the gospel. And so it's similar to kind of the third view of Pistis Christou, people like Benjamin Schleicher and Preston Sprinkle, who are advocating for something bigger or more comprehensive than subjective and objective. So, for example, when we get to chapter 3, when faith came, well, it can't be my faith because Abraham already had faith, and I can't put my justification on my faith. But if it meant just Christ, why didn't he just say Christ? So I think when faith came refers to the fact of a brand new way of relating to God through the new covenant mediated through Jesus, the person of Jesus Christ. That's a lot there. That's loads a lot into this pistis language, but it makes sense of a text like Galatians 2:20. I've been crucified with Christ. I no longer live. The life I live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. There's a relational, almost covenantal dynamic to this. I think when you read in chapter 3, when faith came, to me, it kind of looks back to chapter 2, this dynamic of love and faith that is experienced in and through Jesus Christ. So I take kind of a participationistic approach to faith language when it comes to Galatians. And I think that's what the family language is about in Galatians. That's what the love language is about. That's what the Christology is about. It's about uniting with God through the person of Jesus Christ, which is, he talks about mediation right there in the letter. And there is no mediator except this one person, Jesus Christ, as he later says in the pastoral. So you've read my book. I don't want to put you on the spot, but where would you go differently in Galatians with Paul's faith language?
Probably wouldn't differ. I mean, I do think there's a solid participationist aspect, and it's connected to themes like love, belonging, certainly tied to being in Christ as well. On the Pistis Christus debate on the faith in the faithfulness of Christ, I mean, that really is a hairy topic, and I've never been convinced that either side has the better of the argument all the time. Generally speaking, I'd be inclined to interpret it as faith in Christ, with Christ as the object of faith. Certainly convinced by people like Stan Porter, Barry Matlock, and Francis Watson on that. But there are some places where I think there is an exception, like Philippians 3. I don't know if you remember, but that's what I put into our commentary. So you'll forever be pinned as being a subjective genitive, at least on that text. There are some interesting places, though, where I think there are clear hints that you can take this in a broader sense, particularly in Acts 3. And then there's a passage in the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, which talks about the faith, I think, which is through him. Okay, which is a really enigmatic phrase. It's in Acts 3. It's somewhere in Ignatius, but talks about the faith that is through him, which goes to show that it's not kind of, are you A or are you B? That there is a kind of option C. And several people, such as Benjamin Schleicher, Preston Sprinkle, even Mark Seyfried is another one, who have kind of done that. So but I'm not too sure whether I would say the third option is the norm. I would say it's something we can look at on the menu, depending on the specific text we're looking at. But certainly something to keep at the back of your mind, that it's not just is faith something I believe? Is it a virtue? It's bound up, I think, with Paul's Christology and his whole sense of participation. That is where I would say I think you're definitely right, Nijay.
Well, I'm really interested in chapter 1, I think verse 23, where it talks about Paul in his, kind of just post-conversion, preaching the faith, the pistis, that he once tried to destroy. To me, that's one of the occasions where there's something really interesting going on with faith language. It's not just what we think of as faith, as in doctrine or beliefs. Somehow this term encapsulates Christianity, the Christian way, the Christian religion. Is that how you take chapter 1? What is Paul talking about?
I think Paul can talk about faith as a synecdoche for like either Christ or the whole sense of devotion to Jesus as Messiah and Lord. It can certainly stand for them. I mean, there are passages where pistis can be like a body of truth that's confessed, believed, and entrusted to. But it's also like the whole Christian movement with its ethics, its social groupings, and its identity and its understanding of itself in relation to God and Christ.
Well, I want to go back to N.T. Wright because we've talked about him a bit, and you wrote the New Testament in its world with Tom, and I know on occasion you two disagreed. I know you're similar in a lot of things. It's a lot of big things. But I'm curious if you can give us the hot gossip specifically on Galatians.
Oh, yeah.
What were some areas where you two kind of, crossed swords or disagreed?
We disagreed on very few things, actually, it turns out. But the areas that we did disagree about, and I just deferred to Tom as the senior partner on the project, we did disagree a bit on Galatians. And although our reading of the letter is remarkably similar, I mean, there's probably two aspects I'll talk about. The one aspect we'll talk about is the dating. Now, I'm convinced that it's definitely written to South Galatia rather than North Galatia. For those who don't know, a long time ago, it's like, you used to think Galatians was written either early to South Galatia, before the Jerusalem Council, or it was written later to North Galatia, well after the Jerusalem Council. So did you date it like 48 or did you date it like 55? I think that kind of division has now shattered. I think most people would argue it was written to South Galatia. The question is, was it written before or after the Jerusalem Council? And that comes down to, do you think Galatians 2, 1-10, does that refer to the famine relief visit in Acts 11, or does it refer to the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15? Now, I've read some good arguments for why Galatians is written before the Jerusalem Council. People like F.F. Bruce, Richard Longnecker, I thought gave a very good argument for it too. And this is arguably Tom's own position. But I'm convinced that there's far too many similarities between Galatians 2 and Acts 15 to be overlooked. So I think they are referring to the same event. And if you don't believe me, go read Craig Keener's Acts commentary. I think he gives a very good argument for saying why Galatians 2 and Acts 15 are indeed the same event. So that does have a little bit of significance, because that would mean that the incident at Antioch is kind of a breaking down of the Jerusalem agreement, or at least it's breaking down in terms of addressing things that were not addressed at the council. So, for example, at the council, everyone said Gentiles don't have to be circumcised. Fine. But no one said, but what's the basis for Jews and Gentiles to have fellowship together? Okay. And some may have said, well, either you separate unless the Gentiles get circumcised. So it was kind of these unstated things, which I think led to the tension. And that comes to the second issue about where Tom and I think slightly disagree. I think Tom goes for the view that the intruders in Galatia are trying to disambiguate the status of Gentiles. I mean, they're not Jews, but they're not following pagan festivals and holidays and worship the emperor. Therefore, converting to Judaism of some form will resolve their ambiguous status. Okay, so it seems to be something along those lines. Whereas I'm probably more convinced of what's called the Jewett thesis that's put forward by Robert Jewett, that what's motivating the intruders, both people who came to Antioch and then to Galatia, is the idea that Christians are being persecuted in Jerusalem and Judea on the basis of the reputation of what Paul and his churches are doing. Okay, so they're kind of like, they're hearing about what Paul and his kind of Torah-free mission for Gentiles are doing, and even Peter's consorting with Gentiles, apparently. That news is getting back to Judea, and the Judean church is being persecuted as a result. And so some people have gone to Antioch and Galatia saying, okay, look, that's to take the heat down on the Jerusalem believers. You guys just need to play the Jewish game for a bit. So come on, put your man on the bench. Let's just put a little bit of a cut in it and take one for the team. Take one for the saints back in Jerusalem, guys. And Paul would argue that I think I'm quoting HD Betts here, that the intruders are trying to save their own skins by forcing the Gentiles to part with a small piece of theirs. Which is a funny way of putting it. I think it was Betts who said that, or maybe it was Carson or Bruce. I can't remember.
It sounds like something you would say.
Well, it is something I would say. It is something maybe I said it. I don't know. I say a lot of things, Nijay. I can't keep track of all my witticisms.
Let me ask you something following up on the Antioch incident, because I'm genuinely curious. What do you think Paul and Peter's relationship was really like? I mean, there's kind of this view of this kind of very cold shoulder relationship that's persisted through the years. I want to believe that there must have been some kind of unity amongst the apostles, but what do we know, and where do you go with that in terms of their ongoing relationship in the first century?
Well, you get the feeling that they had a cordial relationship at least. But then when a crisis came, they responded differently. You could argue that Peter, Cephas, kind of caved into the pressure. This is at least Paul's perspective, that he caved to the pressure, and Paul wanted to kind of steel himself and remain true to what he thought was the principle. God accepts Gentiles as Gentiles, and so should we. And so we don't go for the view of equal but separate. And we don't put any other sort of burden in front of Gentiles to be members of the church. I have to say, the incident at Antioch is probably the one part where I would be slightly closer to the Paul within Judaism school than normally. And that is because I don't think Peter was living as a Gentile. I don't think Peter was eating pork sandwiches. I don't think he was kind of, eating shellfish, kind of like partying on Friday nights. And I don't think the food that they were using was necessarily unkosher. I mean, in the diaspora, there's a spectrum of ways you can be faithful, ranging from complete separation all the way through to just be conscious who you hang out with type of a thing. So I don't think when I think he's living in accord with Gentiles, and he's not imposing anything upon them. So the issue was not the menu they were eating; it was the company that they were eating with. The men from James who came forward objected to eating with Gentiles or being with Gentiles in such as a way that would imply that they are just the same as covenantally faithful Jews, because that is affronting people back down in Jerusalem. Remember, when in Acts, when Peter's hanging out with Cornelius, he goes into his house. And when he goes back to Jerusalem, people say, Peter, you went into a Gentile's house and you ate with him, which I think in the Jewish mind is a little bit like going into a sewer and eating what you find there. I mean, this is just maybe that's a bad analogy. But it's kind of like in terms of purity scruples. And I think people can't believe Peter is doing that. And Paul says, well, no, that is the basis of the gospel. We believe that God saves the circumcised and the uncircumcised by faith. Okay. And if he accepts them, then we accept one another. When you say, okay, that's true, but we're going to be equal but separate, Paul sees that as a violation of the gospel. And I know this is a Dita Betts quote. They chose purity over unity. Okay,
Yeah.
and so that's probably the one aspect where I think I would be closer to the Paul within Judaism school. But yeah, I mean that's how I think the debate plays out. That's why I'm probably more aligned with the Jewett thesis about persecution in Jerusalem. Although I can see it working with the things that people like Wright and I think it's Bruce Winter, and also who else is it? Todd Wilson, who argues for a similar thesis about the local pressure to sort of disambiguate the Gentiles. Whether are they Jews, are they Gentiles, what are they? And law observance will provide a kind of religious cover for them, for the type of activity that they're undertaking.
Are you thinking of Justin Hardin?
Justin Harding. Sorry.
Yeah.
Apologies to Todd Wilson. I may have maligned him.
They're both white people, so I could get it.
White Pauline scholars, dime a dozen. Apologies to all my poor scholar people, friends out there. Yeah. But there's a couple of other tricky passages in Galatians, Nijay. One of the big ones. Do you have any thoughts, feelings about the Israel of God in Galatians 6:16?
Man, when I thought about writing on Galatians, there are a couple of passages that scared the daylights out of me in terms of just staring up this mountain of scholarship and trying to find a way to succinctly, in a smaller, level commentary, get through it. So one of the passages, as we've talked about in the past, Mike, is the so-called allegory, Galatians 4. But another one is this passage at the very end, peace be upon and mercy. What is that all about? I flip-flop back and forth. Probably when I was in seminary, I took the view that Israel of God was an all-encompassing kind of people of God kind of thing, in line with Tom Wright. And then, I can't remember John Barclay, but I think Susan Eastman and several others advocate for Israel of God as just the kind of ethnic Jewish people, maybe Beverly Gaventa as well, if I recall. And I think I was persuaded slightly towards that, having done a commentary now. And this is one of the few times I disagree with Jimmy. I'm back on the side that Paul's going to be polemical to the bitter end of the letter.
Yeah.
And he's going to hold his ground. And let me just say, one of the reasons I'm persuaded by that, I mean, there's all sorts of interesting exegetical stuff in the text itself, but one of the reasons I'm persuaded about that is, and we could talk about this because it's its own issue, the we language in Galatians. Paul seems to throw himself in with the Gentiles sometimes, or possibly throw the Gentiles in with the Jews. And I think maybe Lou Martin said they have a monolithic history at some points. Something like that is going on where he kind of intermixes with Gentiles, almost as if he's an honorary Gentile. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but because of and yet at other times in other letters, he's very clearly identifies as Jewish, and 2 Corinthians and Philippians and Romans and Colossians. So I think at the very end, he is holding his ground and saying, no, this is the one people of God. I will say, and I do in my commentary, make it very clear, this is not condemning Jews. It's not replacement theology in the sense that it's, meant to damn Jews or anything like that. But if I'm being honest, my reading is that he is viewing Israel God as a one people of God, Jew and Gentile.
Yeah. I mean, I'd agree with that. I mean, for those who don't know, I mean, what the text says, this is like in Paul's benediction, peace and mercy to all who follow this rule, to or even to the Israel of God. And the debate has been, who is the Israel? Is it like just ethnic Jews, or is it also believing Jews and Gentiles? I think you alluded to. I think the best argument for treating it as ethnic Jews is offered by Susan Eastman. I thought she did a very good argument and you could argue that what Paul is trying to do, he's arguing very forcefully for his view for the equality of Gentiles as Gentiles in the church. They do not need to have the Torah foisted upon them. They should not be forced to be circumcised, to be Christ believers. And then at the end of it, he kind of offers a bit of an olive branch. Okay, look, peace to everyone, especially to the Israel of God. It's like saying, I mean you no harm, no disrespect, and I'll treat you with an honorific term like the Israel of God. So I can definitely see that making sense. But there's a number of things that persuade me that he's referring to the Church of Jews and Gentiles. Number one, Paul has pretty much spent the whole letter, and indeed invested his whole apostolic career, that Gentiles are just acceptable as Jews before God in light of faith in the crucified and risen Christ. And he argues very forcefully, both in Galatians and in other places, that those inherited Jewish privileges, as good as they are no longer determinative for your status before God. Okay, so he kind of does kind of out this privilege, and he says, like, in Christ there is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, that type of a language. So he's trying to say that being Jewish does not put you a little bit closer to the throne of God, which I think some of his competitors or some of his compatriots would have tried to argue. He completely deconstructs that, in my mind. And if that is his main theme, the equality of Jews and Gentiles before Christ, I don't think at the end he's going to say, oh yeah, and Jews are a little bit better because they're part of the Israel of God. The other thing that makes me think that it's a complete all-encompassing thing is that the way he uses a similar language elsewhere, like in Philippians 3:3, he says, we are the circumcision,
Mm-hmm.
we are the ones who worship God by the Spirit. And similarly, at the end of Romans 2:25 to 30, he uses this very similar language where it talks about one who is a Jew inwardly and not outwardly. And what he does there is argue that Jewishness or covenant identity is imputed to Gentiles, even that they're not circumcised. Okay, so I certainly think that that Paul considers Gentile Christ believers as being part of something like an Israel of God. Now, we do have to be careful that we don't want to go into a very brutal supersessionist theology, or have the idea that, well, the Jews had their chance, but they've been voted off the island and now God's doing a Gentile thing. We want to avoid that. But I think the nature of the argument, the wider context of Paul's discourse and argument, supports Gentiles being included within this Israel of God. That's how I see it. But yes. Well, let's finish off, Nijay. Let's finish off with having a good yap about Galatians. What would you say is the number one application of Galatians? Because in your Story of God Bible commentary, there's a lot of application. I mean, this is a commentary series where you have to do a lot of application. And
Right.
As hard as the exegesis is, I think we would both agree the application is the hardest part, particularly when you're in places like Galatians 4. The application is Galatians 4 is don't worry about using allegory in sermons. Paul does it. I mean, I know maybe it's one application, but what would you say is the number one application for Galatians?
Right. Can you still hear me okay? My microphone went kind of crazy. Okay.
Yeah, it's got a slight little bubbling underneath, but it's okay otherwise.
Okay. So that's hard to say if there's one, but I will say from my reading of Galatians, and actually I get some of this from Luther, and I'm not really big into kind of Lutheran interpretation, but I've sat down and read Luther's commentary on Galatians, and this dogged emphasis on making Christ the focus and center. And we can say that all day long in church, but Paul means it in a very specific way. Whereas Jews would say, perhaps Paul's opponents, his Jewish Christian opponents or disputants, would say, hey, yeah, Jesus is the Messiah, but there's this Torah thing that's going to guide us and we're going to be sheltered and protected under it. And Paul's saying, no, there's a whole new way. There's nothing wrong with the law. The law's not bad per se, but there's this now kind of centered focus on the Christ relation, on following Jesus, on walking with him. And John Barclay wrote a really good dissertation many years ago, I think in the 80s, on this idea of, okay, without the law, was there going to be no Christian ethic, no Christian direction? Was it going to be kind of aimless? And no, the chapters 5 and 6 very clearly point out how the law of Christ, which is Paul's clever way of saying probably conforming to who Christ is, his way, his nature, and love, the love ethic, these are going to really guide us into our Christian life. And cruciformity, if there ever was a text that backs up Mike Gorman's claims about cruciformity, you have it right there. May I never boast in anything except, being crucified of the world, and, world being crucified to me, the cross of Christ. So I would say I would take cruciformity as the heart of this letter. I would probably say it as cruciform faith, hope, and love, centered on becoming like Jesus, following Jesus, something like that. I take a much more dynamic and kind of in motion approach to the theology of Galatians than just sort of here are the 10 doctrines that are most important. What would you say? How would you respond to that?
Oh, a number of things. Yeah, I do think, I think you're absolutely right. Cruciformity, but as it yields certain things like family, faith, hope, love, fruit of the Spirit, I think is very big. And I think Galatians is very, very big on the idea for anyone who says you need Jesus plus. Okay,
Right.
you need Jesus plus this particular halakha, this way of obeying the law, or you need to join my crazy cult, or you need to vote for this political candidate, or something along those lines. So yeah, I mean that's I think it is, and that you add that to the idea, and the idea, I think that you'd probably agree with this. The big motif is Christ has set you free from the law that can condemn, from the powers of this
Mm-hmm.
age, from the judgments and the superstitions of people, and yeah, then to dovetail into 2 Corinthians, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. I think that's probably a good way to end.
On cruciformity, one last question. I've always wondered when Paul talks about let no one bother me because I bear in my body the marks of Jesus. There are interesting ways of interpreting that. It could be slave wounds. It could be cruciform marks, crucifixion marks. I've always wondered if stigmata. Yeah, I've always wondered if there was some connection to circumcision being a mark, and then Paul's persecution or whatever also being a mark. What's your take on why does he talk about marks at all in this letter?
Oh, I got no idea. Yeah, I naturally just thought it's basically some injuries he's acquired because of his faith. Like he's got some scars from having the daylight beat out of him. Maybe he's received the 39 lashes a few times, and I'm sure they would leave a few scars. Or he's just kind of had the snot beaten out of him by people in places like Antioch or Ephesus or like that. Yeah, so I don't have any strong feelings on the matter. But yours is interesting. But then in the same section, what do you do with the large letters?
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because I think you tweeted about this, didn't you? That it's kind of like all caps, tweeting in all caps. Didn't you say that?
Yeah. So
there's a couple theories. One theory I think is Chris Keith, who kind of says, a writer will take over to show off their education.
Okay.
And I don't agree with that. But then opposite theory, there's a monograph by, I think Steve Reese is his name, who makes the opposite argument that large letters would show your poor writing skills. I think actually both of those are wrong. And I think Paul was being emphatic because it's not just his large letters. It's the fact that he's actually making light of it. He's actually pointing it out. That he's kind of like, give me that, I need to make sure people understand this. So I would say the all caps thing, I think I used that in my commentary before I had read your tweet. And I think there's some similarities there to this idea of using size for emphasis. Were you being facetious, or do you think that's a possibility?
Oh no, I think Paul may be being emphatic. I mean, he could be just doing it large letters to say this is definitely me. Okay, this is Paul, right? Just in case you're missing,
John Hancock.
Yeah, putting a very big definitive letter. Yeah, impressing people with his calligraphy. Hmm. Educating his education, proving how unlearned he is. I don't know. I think it's either a mark of authenticity or integrity.
Right.
That's how I'd see it.
There you go.
There we go. Well, that's probably a pretty good note to end on, Nijay. So we can stop there. That's been fun. Once again, I think last time we did Gospel of John. This time doing Galatians. Do we know when your Galatians commentary will be out? Do we have a scheduled date?
Well, as some of the listeners probably won't know, you're one of the editors, so it's got to go through all that feedback and back and forth. My best hopes would be early 2022, possibly if we're very lucky, late 2021.
Yep.
I would love for it to be out ASAP, but with things still going on in the world the way it is, who knows? But you actually, speaking of publications, I think are you involved in a Cambridge Companion that's coming out really soon?
Yes.
Tell us about that quickly.
Like February next month, I think, the Cambridge Companion to the Apostolic Fathers.
That's right.
Should be out.
Yeah.
And that is going to be good. That is a crack-a-lackin' book. There is some great stuff in that. Great essays on Papias by Stephen Carlson, which will make it worth the price of the volume alone. I get to cover Diognetus, but we've got some great people contributing to that. Claire Rothschild, Janelle Peters. We've got Philip Alexander covering Judaism like in the 2nd century. It's a terrific book, and it's good because it's kind of like the sequel to the New Testament. If you like a little bit ambiguous, Apostolic Fathers.
I mean, that's heretical, but yes, I know what you're saying.
Yeah. So So I if people are interested in Apostolic Fathers, the paperback will be cheaper than the hardback. But that's what you can be looking out for.
And you mentioned this before. Cambridge Companion is having a big year because the Cambridge Companion to Paul 2nd edition came out.
Yep.
And then also the Cambridge Companion to the Gospels is coming out next month.
I did not know that.
And this is big news. The Cambridge Companion to the New Testament is coming out in April.
I'm in that one.
I'm in that one as well. What did you do?
Really? I did not know that. I did Gospel of Mark.
Did you? Okay. I did 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
So
good. Yeah. Well, you do know a bit about that. I know this.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. I edited your commentary and your other volume, so I'm very acquainted with the Gupta corpus on the Thessalonian correspondence.
That's right. Yeah.
That's good.
All right. Well, thanks, Mike.
That is a big year for the Cambridge stuff. That is a big Cambridge. But yes, okay, that's enough promos at the end. That's good. Well, mate, you take it easy in Portland and everything, and I'll be enjoying the rest of house arrest here in Melbourne grad. And Lord willing, we can chat again maybe in a month or so about anything else.
I'm gonna need to brush up my Epistle of Diognetus if that's next.
I'm actually working on another Diognetus project right now. So and that's a lot of fun. That is a lot of fun. Yeah, get your Diognetus on, man. Get your Diognetus on. Well,
you've quoted Diognetus here and there in some of your work. I remember there's a couple juicy Diognetus quotes.
A lot of all my sermon illustrations are either Star Wars, Les Mis, Diognetus, or things that happened to me in the army. That's pretty much my 4 sources of sermon illustrations. So
we're gonna need to do one of these videos just on the Mandalorian, I think.
Like you mean this? Yes.
That's it.
My just a cute product placement for our videos. And
I have Mandalorian pajamas, so I'll have to wear those on the day.
Yeah, or maybe you could wear them to SBL. SBL needs a pajama day. I swear. I'm gonna say, let's have a pajama day. Tasteful pajamas, mind you. Tasteful pajamas. We don't want to. But that or a funny hat day, or I've always thought about doing an SBL Comic Con kind of like synthesis or mash, maybe if we could combine the two conferences together.
There you go.
That would be weird. Probably won't take off, but we'll see how we go. Okay, this is our third and final attempt at ending the video. Nijay, always a pleasure to talk to you. Stay safe in Portland, my friend. Long live the American Republic. And yeah, if you need me, I'll be quarantining here in Melbourne. Take it easy, man.
Good day, Mike.